other movements. It's where some of the really sort of right-wing Catholic movements begin. Opus Dei begins in 1935, same year as the Family. All these movements begin in the middle of the 30s in response to FDR. And yeah, he's a centrist, but they don't like him. They don't like democracy. They don't, I mean, I'm not casting aspersions. The Family said, you know, democracy is done. We need something better. It said, can't compete with communism. We don't want to be communist. Fascism, well, no, there's something there, but they've got this Hitler, this Mussolini. That's Jesus's chair. Hitler's got to get out of that chair. They like the idea of fascism, but they got the wrong guy in charge, is their look at this. So they end up coming up with these ideas that the Family calls, but other movements use this language, the totalitarianism of Christ, right? Now, at this point, it's not a social movement. The social movement in the 1930s is still, all that energy is on the left, right? But they build, and they build over the years. And the first thing they do is they say, look, we got to break the spine of organized labor. Because the right is never going to have a broad movement as long as organized labor is really strong. And, you know, with respect for labor friends who may be here, labor is not strong, or I mean, it's very, very weak now, right? This is what fundamentalism, this is kind of elite fundamentalism, sets out to do. They said, we're not going to talk about pornography. We're going to talk about labor, but they're going to do it in this interesting way. They're going to say, instead of talking about conflict, let's talk about cooperation. Let's talk about labor management cooperation. Let's look at labor leaders who want to sit down at the table in the spirit of Christ and cooperate with us, and trust us to have their best interests at heart. Trust us might be the sort of the slogan of this thing over the years. All this comes to a head, right? And about 30 years ago now, with the creation of the modern populist Christian right. We got two movements. And that's the movement that I'm really talking about when I say this movement that has room for intellectuals, it has grassroots. It's very, very diverse, much more diverse than a lot of people want to talk about. You talk about the Tea Party movement and so on, they're putting people in the streets. Left isn't doing that right now. They are. They're doing all this energy, and of course, where are they getting these ideas? They're studying us. They're studying us. I mean, they know leftist history. You know, they would love a conversation like this. They said, "This is great. We're gonna learn a lot." In Dispatches, one of the essays, Dispatches from the Religious Left, one of the essays talks about one of these notions that is popular now among liberals, leftists, folks who would be religious progressives, which is we have to copy the right. We have to learn from the right. They're so effective. And there's this mistaken idea that what we have to learn from the right is message discipline. And do you remember who wrote this essay? I'm ashamed I can't remember the author of this particular piece. He said, but that's not the thing that you learn. The right has taken from the left, and what we need to take back from them is not just conflict in the public sphere with those who we disagree with, but within our movement. You know, sitting here and disagreeing and having a really ideologically lively, diverse movement.
Well, you know, the interesting thing, I've recently been seduced by Zizek, the philosopher who CB, who's my assistant, often calls my boyfriend. Is that also a fundamental critique of capitalism seems to be lacking among religious leaders and on the left. That the way in which the Family that you so eloquently describe in terms of how they deploy language of totalitarianism, this kind of notion of imperium, this use of free market solutions as the fundamental way to respond to ecological as well as human crisis. It seems the case that there's an unwilling to bear critique on capitalism, and that we've ultimately been seduced by the same kind of market language in the way in which in such a way that those of us who are on the left and who want to bring a critique, who talk about a capturing and confining and a critique of markets in such a way that they don't exploit the earth, they have greater access to living wages for the poor. And so I'm just curious how the family has done that in such a successful way. I think part of it is that they're participating in a normalized discourse already, right? So you just turn on the television, GDP is up, that means the recession is over, right? When 50% of African American men are unemployed in New York City, in places like South Jamaica where I pastor, Brooklyn, and in Harlem, those numbers go up to 70%, right? Or that my church physically sits at the center of the foreclosure crisis. There have been more houses foreclosed around the 4-block radius of my church than any other place in New York State. So I'm just curious, like, what has happened? How have they executed that language? I do believe the culture and notions of certain American free market are at their benefit, but it just seems like they've honed a message, that there is some message discipline there, and I'm curious about what does that.
Well, I mean, the message discipline really comes from, as you said, this is a normalization process. And this goes back, the family I mentioned, they had this public event, the National Prayer Breakfast. This goes back, 1953 is the first breakfast. You ask most congressmen who go, they'll tell you, says, well, I think this goes back to the beginning of the Republic, when George Washington dedicated America to Christ. There are a number of congressmen who will say this. You can find on all kinds of government documents this prayer that apparently George Washington said. He never said it, but it's been sort of put into the public record. So the family goes back and they go to FDR, actually. They say, let's do this annual event to consecrate United States to Christ. FDR says no. They went to Truman, who people forget about Truman. Truman was he was crazy for God, and it was a scary God. Truman was a very religious conservative guy. But, you know, he understood the Constitution, and he said, no, we can't do that. They went to Eisenhower. Eisenhower said no. Eisenhower, by the way, I believe was the first president to be elected who did not and had never belonged to a church. He promised once he got elected he would get baptized, and he went across the street and got himself baptized. And, you know, Eisenhower is famous for saying, I don't care what you believe in, as long as you believe in some God. You've got to have a God, and it's got to be a single God. He understood the value of this. And he also said no to the National Prayer Breakfast, but he owed favors. He owed political favors. Billy Graham had just organized the first time Southern evangelicals really turned out for a Republican, not a Democrat, not a Dixiecrat. And he said, yes, let's do this event. And the family, and he said, I hope it doesn't become tradition. And yet it has. It's become such a tradition that it's aired on C-SPAN. Probably no one's ever watched it. It's boring. It's really boring. I mean, it's stunningly boring. And it's meant to be that way because they understand. They said, you know how we can numb everybody to death and we can do what we want? Let's just talk ecumenically and we'll just have everybody up there. And a couple of years ago, they brought Bono. Bono talked. You know, everyone says, well, how bad can this be? Bono there. Very bad, Bono. That's an aesthetic judgment on my part. But meanwhile, what they've done is they said, look, it's. Of course, we accept the fact that we would have this strange religious ritual that would make James Madison turn over in his grave and would make Thomas Jefferson, you know, pick up arms. We can have this ritual, and we can filter so much of our politics through this idea of public piety. And each president after another tries to outdo the last. And you read the right-wing publications right now, one of the things that just galls them, they say, it is so unfair that Bush took all this heat for always talking about Jesus, because Obama has talked about Jesus so much more than Bush ever did. There's people who count these things. How many times did you say Jesus today? And they've been counting. Because it's this language that has become the sort of a language that obscures rather than reveals any religious truth, any kind of